Hola, buenas tardes, queridas y queridos colegas, estudiantes, amigos y amigos de la Escuela de Antropología de la UC. Es para mí un honor, una alegría y también una gran emoción en el año de inicio de nuestro doctorado de Antropología UC, dar la bienvenida a la destacada antropóloga, la profesora Marilyn Strathern, quien nos dictará la charla magistral Siempre relacionando, reflexiones sobre algunos pasados y futuros en antropología social. La profesora Strathern es profesora emérita de Antropología Social en la Universidad de Cambridge, miembro de la Academia Británica desde 1987 y pertenece a la excelentísima Orden del Imperio Británico desde el 2001. Durante su trayectoria ha recibido innumerables reconocimientos, como la Rivers Memorial Medal y la Huxley Memorial Medal, otorgadas por el Royal Anthropological Institute, la Viking Fund Medal, otorgada por Werner Grant Foundation, y el Balzac Prize in Social Anthropology de la International Balzac Prize Foundation. Ha recibido el grado de doctor honoris causa por más de una decena de universidades, es autora de decenas de influyentes monografías, artículos y volúmenes editados, destacando The Gender of the Gift de 1988, After Nature de 1992, Partial Connections del 2004, Kinship Law and the Unexpected 2005 o Relations and Anthropological Account, recién publicado el año pasado por Duke University Press. La profesora Strathern es una de las académicas más originales e influyentes en la historia reciente de nuestra disciplina e inspiradora de generaciones de antropólogos y antropólogas y también de las disciplinas hermanas. Su etnografía, su teoría, su capacidad de aportar a la disciplina reflexionando sobre sus devenires o su meta antropología son una fuente de inspiración y desafíos recurrentes que agradecemos honradas y honrados. Su trabajo, lamentablemente, cuenta con pocas traducciones al español, por lo que esperamos que esta charla sirva como una introducción a su trabajo para quienes se encuentran en su etapa formativa o formación en antropología. Para terminar, y parafraseando a nuestro amigo Alberto Corsín Jiménez, que también está por aquí presente, al introducir su trabajo, él dice: esperamos a las y los participantes, en este caso, a relacionarse con su trabajo, en tanto, en algún sentido, el propósito de su escritura no ha sido otro que relacionar, narrando, conectando y analizando los efectos generativos de la imaginación etnográfica. Así es que con mucha alegría le voy a dejar entonces la palabra a la profesora Marilyn Strathern.
Professor Murray and members of the department and the university and colleagues. Celebrating your newly launched PhD program makes this invitation a very special honor, and your welcome encourages me to combine some old and new reflections on a concept and practice central to our anthropology: relation, relating. This is said in appreciation of the way in which the School of Anthropology at this university has already put relations on the map as far as Indigenous South America is concerned. I'm thinking of the Wenner-Gren Symposium on What is a Relation and the ensuing issue of the journal Social Analysis, whose 3 editors are among my hosts today. I thought it might be interesting to ponder on certain antecedents to their conversations. Alongside warm thanks to my kind hosts, I'm particularly grateful to the translators of this piece, and I hope I won't have increased the task by having an awkward word relation at its center. But words aside, I have a slight problem of exposition. Let me explain. As I started sketching out something of a backstory to anthropological relating, the argument became crowded with too many names, too many allusions, both ethnographic and theoretical, too many, that is, for a spoken piece. Creating slides of names wouldn't really have helped, and in any case, I would rather depend on your mind's eye. So I've taken the liberty of presenting those names as more like characters in the narrative genre of a detective story. Here, of course, I wish I knew something about Spanish theatre or Chilean thriller writing. I did, though, come across a review of the first book to be translated into English of a Chilean politician and crime writer, Roberto Ampuero, only to find it contains a description that, conversely, could have been written of some academic anthropology, and it's too good to pass by. Brulé, the detective, is not the sort, I'm quoting from the review, Brulé, the detective, is not the sort you would hire for an investigation that was at all urgent. There's always time for another cup of coffee or a lengthy meditation. The narrative soon acquires a dreamlike quality, slipping from place to place and from time to time. The prose saunters along, following serpentine sentences to uncertain destinations. Well, my whodunit is only a device to help along the spoken word. There's no body and no crime, only some intellectual puzzles, and we are all detectives here. I'm sure much will be familiar to you, and when I refer to our detective, it will be to a figure that floats between us. At the same time, I have to act as raconteur and will have a voice in that role. The hope is that this device will throw light on an issue often overlooked in the pursuit of another, more obvious one. Fundamental to the practice of anthropological inquiry is the explicit relation between the language, the conceptual world of the anthropologist, and that of his or her interlocutors. Yet that often obscures something that anthropologists may be implicitly aware of, but generally imagine they can avoid or skirt around. This is the relation between the language of anthropologists' analysis and their own vernacular. More than a question of refining everyday speech for expert use is also the way in which vernacular usage inevitably colors or gives a tenor to the professional language. How to plot a narrative to bring this second issue to light. Now, as raconteur, I lay out two problem areas for investigation, a case, and then a case within the case. For our detective, bent on solutions, might fall into the trap of thinking that all problems are soluble. Certainly there are problems that present puzzles to be unraveled, and one such puzzle over the word relation is unearthed in the inner investigation, the case of the blind spot. The encompassing investigation, which we take in two parts, attends rather to a problem in the sense of problematic, an oscillation of perspectives on relations that's probably in our interests to keep oscillating, the case of the changing perspective. While the two are distinct, there is also traffic between them. The puzzle may help us comprehend the problematic. Without more ado, the raconteur nods to the detective to begin. The case of the changing perspective, part 1. The first job, says our detective firmly, is to identify the problematic. Stated simply, what counts as a relation? The problematic has been admirably addressed by colleagues here who press for an openness to multiple responses. In making relations an open question, they are more ambitious for this key analytical tool than many of those who have asked of other social phenomena whether, for example, the X or Y have law or believe in a soul. But the alternatives can be as stark. Relations may be conceived of as conjunctive or as disjunctive. Not that it's always been expressed like that. There have been anthropological discourses in which relating was first and foremost about conjoining. Our detective wants to know more and turns to the elderly raconteur, who gives a quick first-person account. One abiding impression of my training in British social anthropology, says the raconteur, as taught in the Cambridge of the early 1960s, was the exhortation on my teacher's lips to distinguish, always distinguish. Most notably in kinship studies, to distinguish between descent and filiation, or the moral and the dual, and so forth. It seems obvious to me now that this introduces a relation between the terms so distinguished. But then the command didn't carry that connotation. Rather, the aim was to clarify the terms as categories in their own right, make them sharper. Mind you, taken to excess, finer and finer discriminations descended into what critics regarded as hair-splitting. But the object of making distinctions was to emphasize the discrete qualities of the categories of analysis. Simultaneously impressed on us students were versions of a parallel command: relate, always relate. Yet making relations seemed a quite other exercise. Relating meant bringing things together, combining, finding similarities, with or without underlying or overarching criteria being explicit. Relations were imagined as bonds, links, ties. Whether in reference to the social relations that were taken as our subject matter, or in arranging elements of anthropological knowledge, such relating was colored not just by being creative, but by being palpably benign. Our detective sees straight away that in this change of perspectives, now distinguishing, now relating, lay a positivist template, namely that self-generative pursuit of relations between discrete entities that characterized British social anthropology of the time. The raconteur expatiates. Persons had intrinsic qualities as discrete entities, and it was an act of social and conceptual creativity to appreciate the relations lying between them. The positive overtones of making and marking such ties, and where actors interacted, there the anthropologist was creating anthropology, were clear. Relation overcame distinction. Social relations brought people together, just as knowledge relations enabled anthropology students to formulate arguments with reference to discrete categories from apparently disparate facts. That facts as well as persons could be akin to one another, and a benign tenor made them both glow. Aha, interrupts the detective. You're introducing a vernacular English emphasis here. Nodding, the raconteur returns to her time as a student and concludes with a query. In their examinations, students will be faced with the everyday phrase, compare and contrast. Comparing was relating, while its companion word, contrast, dealt with distinguishing. The query is whether such matters really qualify as a problematic of interest to anthropology in general. The debate constitutes the problematic, corrects the detective, resuming the narrative. All you need do is look at contemporary criticism from other quarters, and Louis Dumont is brought forward. British social anthropology, asserts the detective, seen through the eyes of one of its detractors, these are changes of perspective indeed. Dumont followed his famous opening broadside. The British have difficulties with their own language when it comes to defining kinship, with a dismissal of the view that kinship results from the recognition of a social relationship between parents and children. Attempts to build a structural account from this basis were easily ridiculed. Otherwise put, Dumont was dumbfounded by the degree to which interpersonal relations occupied a central position in the British analysis of kinship systems as purported parts of social structure. To Dumont, the sheer inadequacy of British attempts to delineate things through what they called systems and structures was patent. These constructs were logically flawed and could not provide an explanatory framework. Now, at this stage, the detective doesn't go into detail, leaving the raconteur a bit up in the air, because the detective is diverted by a puzzle. Apart from obvious stumbling blocks to intelligibility, there was also something not quite grasped by either side. The particular weight of relations in British anthropological idiom seemed both an oddity, on which Dumont vented his sarcasm, and a block to giving that sarcasm effective purchase. for all his criticism, the British anthropologists at the time often didn't seem to care. Even a cursory investigation shows that the diatribe from Dumont was but one of several criticisms being made of the British school, notably through Lévi-Strauss and the development of French structuralism. And although British anthropologists gravitated to the latter in due course, for all intents and purposes, these were parallel universes. Our detective's memory has been jolted by another case of scholars impervious to criticism, long filed away. Another impasse. The standoff between the 17th century German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz and the British mathematician Isaac Newton. He said, "My hunch is that there is an unsolved mystery here." In a spirit of openness, the raconteur keeps her mouth shut at this shift in time and place. Newton at once offered a comprehensive account of the forces holding the solar system together and deduced a then astonishing generalization, that of universal gravity, for which he specified a singular equation. Upholding an actively intervening creator who sustained nature, Newton refused to frame any hypothesis to account for this state of affairs, for that would be prying into God's secrets. I quote, "Thus, while he had elucidated the law of gravity, he did not pretend to divine its causes. Newtonian science set plain facts above mystifying metaphysics." All this much perplexed his continental counterparts. Skepticism was the immediate European reaction to Newton's vision of forces of attraction across an empty space. Leibniz and other continental philosophers repudiated such a conception of space without relation to anything external. Newton's idea of gravitational attraction as a mutual attraction of one body for another, and I'm quoting, was in contrast to the prevalent way of understanding gravity, whereby heavy bodies are pushed by the action of matter that's further away. The latter had sought to explain. Newton had merely postulated motions corresponding to gravitational forces without accounting for those forces. For Leibniz, objects invariably indicated other objects, and what was meant by space was the resulting ordering of relations. Relationality was ubiquitous. I quote, "Space is nothing in itself, but merely the order or relationship in which celestial bodies move in respect of each other." The Newtonian view was that space did appear as an intrinsic object existing for itself, an independent entity within which other objects move. Here is a historian of the Enlightenment. Newton's account of gravity was a bogus explanation, being nothing more than a system of mathematical relationships elevated into laws with no cause for the physical phenomenon being offered. Newton had simply presented mathematical description dressed up as natural philosophy. He brought down on his head the skepticism of European commentators precisely for not specifying any causal mechanism. The denouement is that this does not seem to have dented the reputation of either Newton or his followers at home. Now, the raconteur is a bit dubious about all this, but doesn't say anything, and our detective sweeps on. Truly a case of changing perspective. Newton was describing relations between entities without specifying the agency that was working on them. Yet the criticism fell short. It didn't seem to matter. Two parties are interested in roughly the same phenomenon, yet a situation seen so clearly by one isn't seen at all by the other. The criticism might as well not have happened. The mystery, muses our detective, is not unlike the mystery of the dog that fails to bark in the night. That is, an absence of the kind of reaction that would have followed an incident. Before proceeding further with the case of the changing perspective, As it elucidates the problematic of what is to count as a relation, the raconteur reminds the detective, the latter pronounces that here is a puzzle to be solved. Was Newton's apparently self-sufficient mathematical relation, along with indifference to continental criticism, somehow repeated in the formulations of British anthropology? With an apparently shared vocabulary of systems and structures, what prevents one party from seeing the relations so important to the other? A fresh line of investigation is needed to identify what constituted the British blind spot. So we come to the case of the blind spot. Here, like Brulé, our detective profits from a meander. This second investigation is going to have to delve further into the kind of anthropology that so irritated Dumont. The detective turns to the raconteur. You say you were brought up in the British school. You can be my first witness. But the raconteur's head happens to be full of Melanesia, and she would probably regard herself as a somewhat errant heir. Never mind, says the detective. Say what you'd say anyway. The raconteur speaks again in the first person. In the social analysis collection, the Amazonianist Els Lagrue in effect asks where in Melanesia one might take relational aesthetics, that is, the way forms reveal relations. And here is an example for her. Children from Hagen in the Papua New Guinean highlands used to draw on the ground the outline of a pig and then, in deep rectangular lines, how it gets cut up. An entire pig may be a wealth item destined for circuits of exchange relations, while a pig cut into small pieces indicates what comes into the household to be eaten, the portions that mobilize this or that relation to those distributing the meat. The children were acting out how shares are made. Lagrue herself mentions the Saba Islanders off the coast of Papua New Guinea for a striking image of relationships. Likened to the angle an axe blade makes with its haft, they conceive of an elbow or turning point in certain relations, as when valuables that have flowed away from a village then return to it. And this takes me back 30 or 40 years, it's the raconteur who is speaking, to a couple of illustrations from formal exchange occasions, one from an island not far from Saba, and the other from the Papua New Guinea highlands. Thus, in the flow of valuables between them, Muyu Island exchange partners keep track of their partners' partners. And I quote, the direct exchange between any two partners is always conceived as an exchange between the people on either side of them. Then there is the role of the spectator at a Highlands Kawa pig kill. The spectator's glance unifies the pig killers, and in his view, they constitute a whole. The pig killer can, by putting himself in the spectator's place, see himself as a member of a unified group. Both examples appeared in a synthetic exercise, The Gender of the Gift, Each Grist to My Own Mill. The latter contributed to an argument about how an event transforms the multiple causes of it into the single occasion of enactment. The former to an argument about the one who acts vis-a-vis the persons or relations who causes his or her actions. But there's no need to linger on that now. What's interesting is a retrospective observation. In these illustrations, there was something I was not seeing. And we could call this a blind spot. The last is directed to our detective, who smirks. There you go, then. The raconteur hurries on, since this is the point at which her divergence from the British school's modelling of relations becomes apparent. If there was something I was not seeing, probably it was because I was seeing other things. Drawing on images of donors and recipients, I was struck by the decomposition and recomposition of pairs of partners into the origins and outcomes of their pairing, wealth, children, and so forth. This has since sedimented in my mind through the words of one of the chapter headings, relations which separate. Indeed, I would now stress the role of division more strongly than I did then. A relation divides, just as a division relates. Division would sound rather extreme, but for an everyday image to hand. After a pig kill, distributions must be made. Recipients turn into donors as they forward some of the gifts to others. The same men also share out meat to their household and close kin, each divide of a backbone or leg, enabling fresh relations to come into view. Changing perspectives is to be heard from the detective. Not really, thinks the raconteur to herself. Viewpoints have changed, but the perspective is the same, since each action is carried out in the knowledge or sight of the other. Relations thus make their appearance through the division between people's respective positions, just as the divisions show up their interdependence. A wife receives this, her paternal kin that, and from diverse hands come pieces to eat. No wonder children play at cutting up pork, enthusiastically outlining an animal's potential partitions. As soon as one division is noticed by the anthropologist, they're noticed everywhere as the focus of deliberate action. Thus, Saba Islanders stress the importance of killing the dead. The dead must be dispatched from the living, cut off from them. As in Hagen, near neighbours of Kewa, a bride is cut from her kin in marriage. In this context, cutting is a local idiom. Thus, in many so-called male initiation rituals, where male nurture is divided from female, cutting relations may require scarifications of the body so that the blood flows. Cutting is thus regenerative, that is, especially marked in the context of producing new states of affairs, thereby substituting one set of relations by another. Yet while dividing, cutting may be idiomatic, relating is another matter. It's relation, not division, that is the tricky concept here. This is not just because there's no generic word for it. Trickiness lies in the way ethnographers use this anthropological analytic. Recall my own blind spot, what I was not seeing in the two illustrations, how to make the blind spot appear. Detection perhaps requires an outside vantage point, a third party to the description. Our detective, who had been getting a bit impatient, perks up. The raconteur relaxes because she knows what she's about to say will lead directly back to the British school, and she knows the right informant to bring in. Such a vantage point is offered by another Melanesianist, the Norwegian Knut Rio, who worked on Ambrim Island. More sophisticated then, but no doubt as intense as the Hagen child's markings, he describes Ambrim sand drawings. As a drawing is being executed, it moves from the perspective of the actors being depicted to, at its completion, that of the drawer in the sand, revealing the latter's capacity to make, and I quote, sociality and relationships conform to a materialized imagery. The finished design encompasses the perspective of social process and places it under the objectified gaze of the third party. Ambrim men, Rio says, display their interactions from a totalizing viewpoint, especially evident on life cycle occasions. Lifetime gifts from maternal kin are coming from those who take up the position of third parties in relation to the father-son dyad, as Ambrim Islanders depict at Bridewell prestations. On such occasions, the bride's mother's brothers sit apart from everyone else, third-party figures who hold a cross-generational view of the whole exchange cycle. In truth, Rio says, the third party can be anyone at any time. When two people meet and engage in relationships, they implicitly know that they're thereby interiorized inside a third person's project as well. Now, generating Rio's analysis is a trenchant criticism of certain accounts of Melanesian sociality. Seen again, the Muyo Islander, for whom valuables coming from one exchange partner are destined for another, is thereby acting out one relation from the view of another. Also seen again, in offering a view on multiple exchanges, the Keiwa spectator thereby objectifies the occasion as a whole. These are indubitably third parties. Of course, every dyad is a triad. Well, Detective Demers, I'm sure you don't have to tell people listening here that, but the raconteur plods on. In Rio's words, if a dyad is conceptualized as such, it's because there is a vantage point upon it, an imagined objectivity in social interaction, and the perspective of totality that arises from imagining this objectivity. It's from the viewpoint of the third figure that the dyad becomes evident, the mother's brothers in whose eyes the father appears in relation to his son. In hammering this home, Rio has a target in his sights. He puts his finger on a conceptual blinker in certain modes of anthropological theorization. This was specifically British social anthropologists' failure to see this third figure in people's interchanges. And I quote from Rio, "In the paradigm of Radcliffe-Brown and in the development of British social anthropology, a conceptualization of society as based on reciprocity cemented itself. Society as an observable network of relations on the ground, evinced through the processual maintenance of stability in dyadic forms." There, the blind spot, tracked down, identified. The raconteur has produced an informant who not only describes but analyzes a relational blind spot, laying it at the feet of the British school. End of investigation? Not so quick, mutters our detective, brows furrowed, who proceeds to point out that Rio's criticism is not independent of Dumont's, but sympathetic to it. "I don't know why you simply swallowed the idea of a blind spot as a failure to see a third figure. Like Newton's absent agent," the raconteur hazards. "Fine," retorts the detective, "but you're dismissing Radcliffe-Brown too easily. You've described the blind spot from an outside position, and I suppose that was deliberate. Yet, given Radcliffe-Brown's influence, I want to know more about his thinking. In any case, you haven't told us what led to the failure, which is the point of the exercise. That is the puzzle." The detective straightens up. "I'd better take over again. In any case," the detective states, "I've now gathered more evidence on an issue so far only briefly mentioned, conceptualizing systems and structures. At the time when the Cambridge students were being introduced to Lévi-Strauss by Edmund Leach, Meyer Fortes was writing his Morgan lectures on descent groups and social structure, and Louis Dumont was introducing French students to British kinship theory. Fortes's and Dumont's eventual books both gave significant space to Radcliffe-Brown. Fortes praised Radcliffe-Brown for the theoretical system to which modern structural anthropology, British style, owns its main frame of analysis. For, Fortes said, Radcliffe-Brown envisaged the nature of kinship systems as systems, a phrase occurring in a passage that hypothesizes a complex relation of interdependence between the various features of a kinship system, allowing such systems to be compared with others as wholes. Dumont quoted the passage at some length and in some bafflement. He asked just how one characterizes a whole. For himself, Dumont asserted, what differentiates a whole from a simple collection is its being ordered internally in a discernible fashion. Thus, a being encompassing body and soul is, in respect of that internal differentiation into parts, a whole. Yet Fortes, too, had a moment of bafflement, this time with Radcliffe-Brown's failure to develop his insight that kinship relations are multidimensional in the dyadic situation, no less than in group structure. And thus, Fortes said, to be considered not only from an ego's viewpoint, but in their total structural setting. After all, this is still Fortes, If we take a person's total field of kinship relations, we find that its management involves compliance with norms that emanate from distinct domains of social structure. Fortis's disquiet concerned Radcliffe Brown's emphasis on dyadic relations. In his notorious 1940 lecture on social structure, Radcliffe Brown had generalized the dyadic paradigm to a high degree. Defining social structure as a network of actually existing relations, he clearly imagined social relations on a person-to-person basis, in that, I quote, the kinship structure of any society consists of a number of such dyadic relations as between a father and son or a mother's brother and his sister's son. Person was correspondingly defined as a structural component. The point is that Fortis's hesitation over this focus on dyadic relations half resonated with Dumont's queries about the central place British anthropologists gave to relations of an interpersonal kind. Of course, objections to the privileging of supposedly dyadic relations persist today. Take the anthropology-friendly French philosopher Vincent Descommes. Descommes isn't an independent witness either, protests the raconteur. That's the point, says our detective a bit peevishly. Indeed, he borrows the very phrase holistic analysis from Dumont. Besides, Descommes writes very elegantly. I was going on to say that, like your informant Rio, he draws on Peirce, the American pragmatist, and his schema of signs. The detective casts a sidelong glance at the raconteur. You really were too quick all round. You didn't adequately theorize the third figure in Rio's account. Here's Rio's theorization. With Peirce's types of signification, thirdness entails a community of interpretation, the shared imaginings that form the background for social realities in the foreground. Whereas such thirdly visualization on Ambrim Island may take the form of persons, in Western understandings, thirdness is likely to take shape more abstractly, Rio says, as belonging to the realm of mentality and rules for behavior acknowledged by the concepts of society or structure. Yet in the development of British anthropology after Radcliffe Brown, Rio suggests, more time was spent on theorizing secondness as the appearance of diverse two-way relationships than on theorizing the constitution of society. Thirdness, society, just as Dumont proposed with regards to the whole, remained an unexamined abstraction. In Peirce's view, dyadic relations always presuppose the thirdness of mentality, law, and order. Rio adds, apropos of his own position, the concept of society is then not merely a question of a series of relationships, but a potential for creating larger imaginaries than can possibly be contained in singular relationships laid out side by side. Now for Descommes, this potential evokes the determination of meaning, the institutions of social life that give people's acts the common context from which their understanding comes. The raconteur bursts in. Isn't that exactly what Radcliffe Brown intended? Persons as elements of social structure can also be imagined as persons in a community. You've forgotten he wrote of kinship systems as systems of dyadic relations between person and person in a community, the behavior of any two persons being regulated in some way by social usage. The detective lets the interjection subside, then slowly continues. Descommes also emphasizes another aspect of Peirce's work. A dyad has two members or subjects, a triad has three. Whether dyad or triad, the figure is a unity. However, note that a triadic action may be expressed by a dyadic proposition. Every triad can be reduced to a dyad when one of its three subjects is left unspecified. The detective winks. Descommes' actual example is shooting a bullet from a revolver, when all one might say is that A murders B. Isn't this the absence we've been looking for? Leaving a crucial dimension unspecified? Might that lead to the notion that there is a latent third term in every appeal to the grounds of a comparison or interaction as the vantage point from which dyads appear? More pertinently, pursues the detective, was there an implicit triad in Radcliffe Brown's mention of community? Relations from the perspective of society, we could say, except that was not what was said. It seemed possible for British anthropology to endlessly point to the social or to society, community, as a context for the conduct of relations between subjects, without formalizing the figure as a subject itself. It's the raconteur's turn to be a bit impatient. I'm puzzled. Are you saying this is what makes the blind spot? That something gets in the way of such a specification? Our detective grins. You gave me the clue, a rather obvious clue. In describing what you had missed in the Saba axe and the Kewa pig kill, you also told me how you had missed it. You missed it not because your mind was a blank, but because it was busy elsewhere. The detective picks up the thread. Consider Radcliffe Brown's precise definition of social relations as existing between two or more individual organisms when there is some adjustment of their respective interests. Speaking of kinship systems with their different elements, as relations within an ordered whole, Radcliffe Brown says, my concern, both in fieldwork and in comparative studies, has been to discover the nature of these relations. If we take Radcliffe Brown's visualization of society as a network of relations literally, he is telling us that relations imply society. In other words, to describe system or society, all you need do is describe the relations. They appear both necessary and efficient. Analysis can always find an outside reference point, the third figure or third term, as in the case of social usage or the background notion of context. Yet what is possible to articulate is one thing, what gets to be articulated is another. In the kind of anthropology attached to Radcliffe Brown's name, we glimpse an impediment that occluded the articulation of the third term. And the detective pauses for effect. The conventional third term, as a distinct vantage point, had a competitor. There already was a third-party figure and had been all along. In the language British social anthropologists were deploying, the figure's additional specification as a third term was redundant. It didn't appear as a quasi-external vantage point. What served as a powerful third-party figure was the way the very concept of relation was being used. Hang on, interrupts the raconteur. Now you're going too fast. Yes, responds our detective. I can put this another way, and you'll see why Descamps remains a useful witness. One of Descamps' preoccupations is the long 20th century debate that at times separated continental Europe from British approaches. I quote, the metaphysical controversy between idealists and empiricists expands a conflict between two visions of social life. For the empiricist, social relations are exterior to individuals, while for idealists, social relations are constitutive of individuals. This is the difference between prioritizing terms over relations and relations over terms. Apropos British anthropology, we may deduce that there was more to it than simply a preference for terms over relations. Rather, the relation, the practice of relating, had acquired a solidity in itself, almost as a concrete entity, as though it too were a term. The third term lay in between the other terms. Just as Newton's work of equation had been weighty enough to hold cosmic bodies in suspension, the detective adds craftily. Faced with the articulate detractors of Newton's mathematical system, Newton's followers had to admit to description without explanation, but given how little it worried them, it might for all the world have been explanation. For Radcliffe Brownians, precisely as soon as there are relations, there is society. Society is already made present in the anthropological act of relating. There is no external explanation. Society doesn't have to be otherwise specified. The raconteur interrupts again. If as itself a third term, the relation has its own solidity and discreteness, what about the exhortation, always relate? But our detective is ready for the question. Think about the robustness of the relation this way. There was that other exhortation you said too, always distinguish, which in the vernacular seems to lead to the individuation of the terms. From an imagination of disparate things intrinsically external to one another, the relation emerges as a mediating conjunction, turning what it relates into entities that explicate one another's characteristics. Relation thus acquires its own intrinsic character, mediation. Insofar as the relation generates that capability, its mediating in-betweenness keeps in tension entities that nonetheless remain discrete from one another. Colloquially, it's as though the relation mediates the parties to a dyad, two figures or terms, and the relation between them, a conjunction of three subjects. So we can begin to understand some dimensions of Radcliffe Brownian anthropology. Although theoretically relations were the enduring structural elements, the terms to the relation also emerged as pre-existing phenomena, as one might describe the way in which descent groups appeared to be given by criteria other than the ties relating them. In the foreground was, for all the emphasis on divergent interests or convergent solidarities, the dyadic interplay of apparently discrete entities joined precisely in the relation between them. It is to the contrary that Rio wants to deploy Peirce's thirdness, not as a middle term between people, but as a constitutive force in the constitution of persons and relations. Years ago, all the elements of observation and reasoning seemed to be in place for the British school to take up the constitutive position. Yet their concern with social structure was simply not articulated that way. In place of a necessity to specify the whole in the distinction of the parts, was instead an interest in complex interdependencies. And in place of emphasizing the totalizing vision that a third term affords, British anthropology developed a disciplinary felicity with comparisons. Entities could be compared in every which way. Where the ground of comparison was acknowledged, it was easily eclipsed by the conjoining relations. In those days, for those practitioners, such conjunctions excited creative anthropological work. Our detective sighs with satisfaction and reaches for a coffee. A brief dialogue ensues. But you wrote about this, didn't you? The detective eventually says to the raconteur. I did, she cedes, but then adds sheepishly, but in talking about the weight of the relations in British anthropology, I didn't really know how to describe it, just referred to an ad hoc quality, thickness, or to its presence or animation. I never analysed its form. In fact, I think I alluded to its formlessness. That might have been a mistake, murmurs our detective. We began with how forms reveal relations. Remember the children from Hagen playing at cutting up the pig? But now maybe we should consider forms of relations. The raconteur jumps in. Oh, but that will take us back to our problematic. We've been dealing with the case of the blind spot, she seizes the chance to say. I think for the moment we can call that puzzle solved. Let's move on. What counts as a relation? That's the issue. Our detective smiles. I've a witness who's been waiting all this time. So we come to the case of the changing perspective, part 2. And you must forgive my efforts at pronunciation here, I apologize. Descamps, not him again, no, wait a bit. Descamps articulated two visions of social life that run through opposed camps of Western thought. But they don't have to constrain us. Our colleagues neatly sidestep the impasse, and I refer to Per Giorgio de Gimignani and Marcelo González Galvez's article apropos the Mapuche on the relation as unfinished objectivation. And I quote, "Relations in the lived world of Mapuche rural residents are neither meeting points between pre-existing entities, nor are they simply constitutive forces between previously underdetermined agencies. This move releases whole areas of inquiry for the future. As they and Giovanna Batidou say in another work, once relations have been conceptualized as more than metonyms for sociality, they can make us think about the social by reflecting upon proportions and scales in the connections among entities." And they quote an unpublished paper of Alberto Corsin-Jiménez. I'm glad I'm not the only one who wishes Corsin-Jiménez had published it, adds the detective. The raconteur, who has learnt much from this Spanish anthropologist, is silent in her assent. In this paper, Corsin-Jiménez separated what British anthropology effortlessly combined, namely interpersonal and conceptual relations. As we've seen, interpersonal relations had become a prime reference point for social relations, while simultaneously the study of social relations offered a template for imagining relations in the abstract. Indeed, conceptual relations still have a vernacular sociability to them. From that point of view, Corsin-Jiménez made a radical cut. In one simple stroke, he stated, kinship is a form of sociality, not a form of relationality, adding in brackets, a proportion, on the other hand, is a form of relationality. If you want to use the language of relationality to explain kinship, then we need to elucidate what the form of the relation is. Pursuing proportion as a form of relation, he drew on his ethnographic work in the Chilean Pampa, where miners at the last of the nitrate mines appeared overwhelmed by the vastness of the desert and the retreat of human presence. In earlier days, people had confronted the gigantic, the unknown desert, by making themselves gigantic, self-assertive, just as subsequently they weighed up their living conditions against what had been extracted for the nation. Proportions do not simply set up links between entities or orders of knowledge, he said, between orders of knowledge that had hitherto remained separate, but they actually measure up those links by positing their degrees of commensurability. Thus, and I continue to quote, relationships as folding out proportionately from an expanded notion of personhood, of persons working themselves out by weighing and proportioning their life projects. After all, only so much social knowledge can be fitted into a relational matrix, by which Corsin-Jiménez means the anthropological logic of ordering that draws relations out of relations through infinite permutations of cross-referencing. In delineating an alternative form of relation, proportion, he showed up the runaway domination of the self-perpetuating relation machine he called algebraic. An algebraic imagination, he said, has long been at work among anthropologists. The raconteur, still worried by the detective bringing in Newton, notes Corsin-Jiménez's reference to the invention of 17th century algebra, relations defined or elicited by their position in a purely formal and nominal system. So Leibniz would dub algebra as the mathematics of indeterminate numbers. A number wasn't itself, but expressed as permutations of other numbers. Replies our detective, oh, I think he's using algebraic in a general sense to talk about those combinations of terms and relations we were discussing, and the widespread emphasis in all camps on orders of relations. He certainly included Radcliffe Brown's relations of association. For Corsin-Jiménez, is putting a less positive gloss on the British blind spot by seeing social life reduced to the description of social relations. Now you're taking us back into the puzzle, complains the raconteur, and I thought the puzzle was more or less solved. Our detective takes time to reply. That's correct on both points. This part of the investigation is about what counts as a relation, and the puzzle is very germane. Think about your hesitation in comprehending relations as having a thickness. All right, we can describe the Radcliffe-Brownian relation as a kind of surrogate third term, but you had to draw on what you've just admitted were unsatisfactory epithets. So the algebraic formula, while giving us a solution to the puzzle, doesn't describe everything that holds for our problematic. The detective seems determined to prod the raconteur at this stage. Haven't we just uncovered weight and gigantism? And what are they? The answer's been staring us in the face all the time. Proportion, they describe by proportion. A proportion is a relation of magnitude. The raconteur is momentarily at a loss. We're looking for forms of relations, explains the detective, and as Corsine Himeni told us, a proportion is a relational form. The raconteur gets that, like a division, she suggests, as when the Hagen children, of course, the response cuts her off. But the raconteur persists. Our subject matter is relations. Can one have a relational form of a relation? The detective can hardly conceal triumph. Yes, indeed, insofar as the relation is an object of knowledge, social knowledge, and people give it presence and value. Another pause. In a small voice, the raconteur asks, by people, do you mean anthropologists as well as their interlocutors? With no reply, the detective's investigatory monologue resumes. There is a final factor, all too easy to overlook, simply because it's so obvious. The British School of Anthropology was English-speaking. Let me spell it out. Calling something a blind spot suggests a kind of deficit. Yet how anthropological traditions talk past one another surely indicates something of interest on both sides of any impasse. If so, we don't necessarily want a resolution in favor of one party or the other. The oscillation may be illuminating in itself, not always, but in, say, the apparent opposition between relation as conjunction and relation as disjunction, we might want to keep alternative views in play, let them spark off each other, and there are analytical choices to keep open too. The detective looks at the raconteur. As when you said, apropos Melanesian idiom, that relation rather than division was the tricky analytical concept, we might, as you've implied just now, want to keep in play the potential of understanding division as a form or version of relation. With this in mind, remark on the tenacity of the puzzle that British social anthropology once posed for its continental counterparts. It cannot be explained from scholarly argumentation alone. That case of the blind spot brought us to appreciate an indubitable weight being given to relations. I've dropped hints that the proportion some scholars gave to relations was supported by vernacular, that is, English vernacular usage. Identifying the English vernacular is more than a linguistic matter. It's also an idiomatic one. There are linguistic twists, of course, such as the English word relation or relative being nouns for kinspersons, and as dismayed Dumont so, kinship meaning a blood relation to the exclusion of affinity. Obviously, we can't take that on here. But to focus on idiom is to focus on usage and inflection. We should stick to the immediate evidence of usage at hand, the writings of the British school as embodied in its avatar, Radcliffe-Brown. A quiet moan of disappointment escapes from the raconteur who had thought that this was the moment for the exposition to expand, the detective reacts. That 1940 lecture is more interesting than you might think. Listen to what it does with the person. It sets out in clearest possible terms the distinction, always distinguish, between a person as an element of social structure or social positioning on the one hand, and the individual as an organism on the other. Oh yes, and the raconteur brightens. I recall pleading with an editor of a collection on feminist anthropology who wanted to reverse the designations to please keep a distinction in Radcliffe Brown's sense. There you go then, the detective continues. Yet, as intimated earlier in the same lecture, he states that relations of association exist between individual organisms. What's happening here? Inconsistency? Now, inconsistency can be a giveaway, a vital clue. I think it's a clue to how English idiom pulls or tugs at attempts for theoretical clarification. English speakers invariably imagine persons as individuals. That in turn makes it an anthropological achievement to analyze individuals as social persons, even though among anthropologists, the figure embodying the social position too often comes to the fore in its vernacular form, that is, the person as an individual. It's difficult to push away. It's there in the debates today, but it was also there way back. So too with relations in ordinary English parlance, the benign tenor they carry, and the positive connotation of joining things together. But rather than going over all that again, comments our detective to the raconteur, since you've dealt with it elsewhere, let me conclude with an observation on the proportional place of the relation. And the detective calls Corsini Meni back. Scholars reproportion their ideas against one another. You're not simply creating a relation between two different orders of knowledge, and I'm quoting, you are in fact moving integrally through such orders with a sense of capacity and thus rebalancing your own powers. As anthropologists of all camps have put them to use, relations not only size other phenomena, but as categories of discourse are also themselves sized. This is one way in which to answer the question of what counts as a relation. Listen to the phrase, what counts as a relation? Among anthropologists, we shouldn't overlook its volume, the amount of space the relation occupies in expositional effort. The raconteur is unsure whether to applaud or to be aghast. But every word or concept in every text is susceptible to someone's vernacular. It'll be an impossible job to scrutinize everything. Our detective shrugs and then cannot resist having the last word. The raconteur is content for this to be the case. After all, she thinks to herself, she said at the outset that we're all detectives here, and the we included everyone listening. It would have been impossible to tell this tale if there were not some common ground to understanding, however diverse the knowledge we each bring, and notwithstanding the patience its telling has demanded of you. Thank you. The dyadic illusion of me talking and you listening, the raconteur ponders, is nothing by comparison with the anthropological interests that we share. The detective's narrative, depending on both of us, as a third term. But the third term in question, our detective, is already rattling on towards a swift conclusion. We were considering one of the more significant notions in the anthropological repertoire. The task was guided by what is already an interest in the multiplicity of relational forms. My elucidation is simply an example of what we might call ethnographic attention to our own tools of thought and analysis. Other people will think other tools are interesting. The world is wide open. Opening up this particular problematic is but the tiniest of moves. On a larger scale, keeping the world open is surely what anthropologists are all about. isn't that what a new PhD program does? Not to replicate what has gone before, but to use our discipline's backstories as springboards to new fields of knowledge and to future ways of knowing and relating. Thank you all very much.
Primero que todo, muchas gracias. Quiero agradecer, profesora, por esta presentación tan provocadora, con tantas aristas, tan inabarcable y en algún sentido abrumadora, en un sentido positivo, por su iluminación y por la posibilidad de compartir sus reflexiones con nosotros. Quiero abrir espacio a algunas preguntas de la audiencia. Si alguien tiene algunas preguntas, vamos a tratar de hacer, en honor al tiempo, preguntas y acotadas escritas, por favor. ¿No? Vamos a partir con una pregunta de alguien de la casa, ¿no? Una pregunta que manda el profesor Pier Giorgio Di Gimignani. Piero pregunta si es posible de alguna manera, o si usted ha pensado cómo pensar las relaciones más allá de la vista, por ejemplo, en un sentido auditivo. ¿Qué forma de lenguaje uno tendría que usar para pensar la relación desde otras formas de percepción?
Well, that's an extremely interesting question, because what it does, of course, is put its finger on, certainly in my own case, a reliance on visual metaphor, almost as it were a diagrammatic way of thinking. And it's, I actually, starting with Else Legroux's own contribution to your collection, her interest in form was initially visual form. I how can I put it? I'm not sure myself that I can make a jump from one mode to another, but I would use the question to reflect back on the extent to which we deal with visual images, with the aesthetics of form and so forth, and that is definitely a limitation of a lot of the arguments that there are.
Tengo más preguntas, pero me gustaría abrir la pregunta a la gente que está en la audiencia también, no solo preguntas que llegaron por otros días. Hay una pregunta de Cristóbal Bonelli, voy a tratar de sintetizarla, espero que la sintetice de una manera correcta. Cristóbal se pregunta por la relación inicial en el argumento entre la física de Newton y la antropología social tradicional de Radcliffe Brown, ¿no? ¿Por qué elegir ese tipo de relación? ¿Y por qué no elegir una relación con respecto a la química y su modelo de relaciones en ciertos desarrollos de la antropología?
Do I understand that was a question of why the particular focus that brought in Radcliffe Brown? Is that the intention of the question?
No, es ¿por qué elegir ese camino entre la física en vinculación con la antropología en lugar de elegir otro camino de conexión para pensar la antropología desde, por ejemplo, disciplinas como la química u otras?
Mm-hmm. The answer has to be that in terms of the way one constructs arguments through particular sets of material. There is no ultimate justification for choosing one set of material over others, but one works with what is at hand and what one has worked through and what one is, in the case of Radcliffe Brown, reasonably familiar with. There is no absolute or logical justification for that, but there is, so to speak, an interpretive or ethnographic explanation, which is that arguments require knowledge and information of certain orders of detail, where one could very easily choose whole other areas to pursue the arguments. I think relation is a general enough term to make that plausible.
Tengo una pregunta que hacen en el chat. Pedro Pablo Achondo pregunta, desde las perspectivas que usted ha expuesto, ¿cómo se puede acceder a las conversaciones con lo no humano? ¿Qué metodología tal vez para explorar una etnografía posthumana?
Yes, I got the reference to non-human or post-human ethnography. What was the question?
¿Cómo usted abordaría una antropología no humana o cómo usted informaría una antropología no humana desde la reflexión argumental de las relaciones parentales, toda esta reflexión que usted realiza en este trabajo, o más allá en su trabajo en general?
Well, I think this would such an exercise would be very much a vindication of what I've been trying to say, that there have been certain kinds of anthropology that have been trapped or entrammeled in a privileging of relations between persons as the template for all relations. And my disquisition was precisely to show this particular historical set of connections, and to be released from that, as we've been shown, means that the question then happily falls away, because there is no problem about using this general term in the context of talking about non-person entities. That, of course, is from a Euro-American or Western point of view. If one is interested in cultures or situations that use something like a European or Western notion of person to describe all kinds of entities, whose cosmos is full of persons, then in a sense we're in a sort of aggrandized situation where what we would call relations are by contrast personified. But that wasn't Radcliffe Brown's position either. I mean, I was trying to criticize this particular position that we've now hopefully long superseded, but also tried to show that there were some interesting issues still to be got from there. I hope that makes some sense.
Sí, claro, muchas gracias. Voy a recoger una última pregunta para no abusar de su confianza. La pregunta que manda el profesor Cristian Simonetti, la voy a leer en inglés, como él la mandó. Many thanks, Marilyn, for the stimulating presentation. I wish to ask you about the most visible relation you just introduced in your presentation, namely between the detective and the raconteur. Aren't they related to the split between science and the humanities, and perhaps between science and the vernacular world? Isn't the detective intimately related to Newton? What is to unveil relations from the viewpoint of a detective?
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that question. I'm not sure I thought it through deeply enough to be able to respond. I'm not sure there was enough substance behind my little trick to be able to answer your question seriously. My choice of doing that really was literally, as I said, a ploy to make more palatable the succession of names that I was bringing to a spoken talk. But as I used this device, I did stumble across something that was quite interesting, which is that in fiction, one can actually express quite a lot very succinctly and very quickly. So there were a number of, I was making a number of digs, for example, at myself and my own style and the way I do things, and that I under-theorize things, for example, and put that into the detective's mouth. And I made the raconteur somebody who had a task to accomplish, was a bit too conscientious, was a bit overbold by the detective. So there was a kind of power dynamic going on between them. I hadn't, though, imagined that the two would fit into other dyads, if you like. But you will see at the end that I tried to I tried to switch things around by reminding us that the dyad here was me talking and you people listening. And I picked up something I'd said at the beginning, that in a sense, the detective was a generic anthropological discourse to which any of you could have contributed. It's not mine, in a sense, and the illusion of me talking to you simply reveals that actually much more interesting is what we all share. I mean, we share far more in our interest, in our general interest in anthropology and anthropology's different subjects than the figure of one person just talking and other people listening. So I turned the detective at the end into a generic piece of anthropological discourse, if you like, that lay between myself and in the figure of the raconteur, if you like, and you people who are very kindly listening. And thank you all for your patience in listening, I should add.
Debo agradecer las otras preguntas que tenemos. Por una cuestión de tiempo, no queremos abusar del tiempo de la profesora Strathern. Vamos a dar por concluida la sesión. Le pido muchas disculpas a Ignacio Pizarro, a Fernanda Gallego, entre otras personas, a Diana, que habían hecho otras preguntas, pero no queremos abusar del tiempo. Ya es tarde en Cambridge, donde la profesora está compartiendo con nosotros, y queremos reiterarle nuestro agradecimiento y hacerle saber que ha sido un gran honor tenerla con nosotros, aunque sea de esta manera virtual y remota, para acompañarnos en la charla magistral de este año, que además coincide con el lanzamiento y el inicio del programa doctoral de la Escuela de Antropología. Así que muchísimas gracias, profesora Strathern, por acompañarnos. Le agradezco también a todos los presentes por su presencia, por su interés y, por supuesto, les cuento que la charla va a estar disponible en el canal de YouTube de la Escuela de Antropología con el audio traducido y con el audio sin traducir para que la puedan revisar si quieren alguna vez más.
Well, thank you very much indeed for asking me to be part of this. I've enjoyed it and delighted to have been with you all.
Muchísimas gracias a todos. espero que nos veamos en alguna otra oportunidad, y a los estudiantes los están esperando para la clase de las 3:30.
That would be wonderful.